A cornerstone of candidate Donald Trump's 2016 campaign was his promise to, quote, drain the swamp. But many have criticized the president for actually adding to a corrosive political climate here in D.C.
Joining us now to talk about Trump's Washington, journalists Suebsaeng and Lachlan Markay. They've been writing a new book called Sinking in the Swamp, How Trump's Minions and Misfits Poisoned Washington. Two great reporters. It's good to see you guys.
Great to have you guys. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
So, I mean, one of the reasons I love following you guys, love following your work, I encourage all the viewers to go follow them on Twitter, is you guys really kind of understood that undercurrent, especially you, Lachlan. You've been reporting on political corruption for quite a long time, about that the disconnect between so much of the Trump message and then one ended up materializing. What are some of the most egregious things that you kind of saw within the Republican grifters that came in the Trump era?
I think the most illustrative example actually comes towards the end of the book, where we talk about the Ukraine situation, which was just sort of beginning to unfold as we published. So we didn't really get to talk about a lot of the impeachment. But, you know, the underlying issue of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, I think really sort of encapsulates a lot of what Trump supporters really despise about Washington.
Yeah.
It's sort of, I mean, you can't with a straight face say it's not corrupt to have a politician's son on a corporate board making $50,000 a month. But it's corrupt in the way that sort of everything, the soft corruption that has pervaded Washington for
standard
decades.
Issue corruption.
Right, and it's a lot of what this sort of populist movement on the left and right is reacting to.
Yeah.
But the president's reaction to it is this very different form of corruption, this sort of overt, in-your-face effort to essentially like weaponize the workings of government to go after a political opponent. And I thought that was sort of a microcosm of the trends we write about in the book, where it's not that Washington wasn't a dirty or swampy or corrupt place before. It's that the president has sort of subsumed this whole town in his image and imbued it with this very sort of Trumpian brand of corruption or incompetence or grifting or whatever you want to call it. So that, I think, is one of the main takeaways.
It's just it's out in the open, right? There's like no hiding it or shielding it from public view.
Right.
I mean, one of the things I was curious about, Swin, is how central was that drain the swamp message, do you think, to Trump's appeal to his base?
Well, I think it was certainly a component. It perhaps wasn't the component, but as Trump himself has readily admitted, a lot of it was almost just like a bumper sticker slogan. He has said numerous times, I think, at this point publicly, that he wasn't sure if that's what was going to sell or stick in 2016, but then he just started saying it, and people started responding to it. But I want to go back to your earlier point about how so much of the corruption, both legal or misconduct, whatever you want to call it, is just so much out in the open nowadays. One of the ways that we've been putting it when we've been talking about this book is that one of the big stories of the Trump era is that what once was erotica is now just full-on pornography in the Trump era. And that applies extremely readily when you're talking about how Trump has wielded corruption in the Trump era while trying to mask it to his supporters or whoever will listen as a form of anti-corruption. It's just another lie.
Yeah, I mean, I do hold this. I mean, I'm not sure, Lachlan and Swin, you guys have great sources in the White House, which is that how much of this is greenlit by Trump himself? How much of it is he frankly doesn't understand the mechanisms of party establishments or of power, and a lot of it goes on, and he'll find out about it and he'll get upset? As in, is it has a direction, or is it just a consequence of the fact that he really doesn't know very much about how the government works?
Well, I think it's a consequence of the fact that he decided he was going to oppose and be in opposition to sort of the establishment. And that requires replacing people who have run Washington for decades with, there's this power vacuum, in other words, that follows. And we're seeing a lot more of that. There was a great Axios story last night about this effort to sort of purge the administration of the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, and replace it with folks who are loyal to Donald Trump. What ends up happening is a lot of the character of Donald Trump, which prizes above all loyalty to him and his agenda, ends up embodying and imbuing the rest of the federal government. So it's that he's replacing. I mean, he's replacing a previous version of corruption with his own version of corruption. And anytime you try to sort of wholesale clean house in an institution as large as the federal government, you're going to be putting in power a lot of people who don't have much experience running it.
Yeah.
And I think that's borne out both in like that overt style of corruption that I mentioned, and also just kind of the general dysfunction that has defined this administration from the beginning.
Swin, I mean, Democrats have really failed to land any punches on that. I mean, it hasn't resonated with the American public at all. They impeached the guy; his approval ratings went up. They've been trying to make some of these cases again and again, and it doesn't seem to land. My personal theory is, just like you were saying, Lachlan, about the Ukraine issue, on the one hand, you have a sort of brazen outright corruption on Trump's side, but then you look at the Democrats and you go, this isn't all that much better. So it's hard for Democrats to have the moral authority to prosecute a good governance, anti-corruption line against this president when, their own bed is a mess.
Right, and also the Democrats aren't just competing against your a Republican Party of yore or of a decade or a few years past. It's sort of been supercharged at this point with what we call in the book the game show host personality cult. I mean, there is an element of hero worship in the Donald Trump era that is unique to a George W. Bush administration or HW administration that we just haven't seen for decades. And that makes the politics a little bit dirtier and a little bit more muddled in the way that you're talking about. It's harder to land a punch against people who might be convincible or of independent political thinking on one end if they're attracted to Trumpism, if you keep hollering on and on about corruption and the Ukraine scandal when they're already hardwired to just believe it's all fake.
So what do you think, Lachlan, just generally, structurally, is this just endemic to Washington? Because you've covered this for a long time. I knew you before Trump was even president.
Yeah.
This is something that has been endemic to our system for decades at this point. Is this just how it's always going to work, or is there actually a way that any of it could be changed? What do you think?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is unique in the post-war era, in the sense that it's very much a reaction against sort of the status quo, the accepted wisdom of Washington for decades. I think that now is the norm. The upheaval against the status quo is now going to become the norm, which means we're going to see more. If Bernie Sanders were to get elected, say, you would see a lot of, you'd see a wholesale revamp of the Washington infrastructure, but in the opposite direction.
Right.
And so I think you'd see a lot of similar sort of problems or trends in a Sanders administration, because you'd see an administration that's basically diametrically opposed to everything that came before it. And that's going to require, it's not easy to turn this cruise ship of such a massive institution in the federal government. So I think a lot of the stuff we talk about, particularly the dysfunction that defined 2017, just unable to get like a coherent policy or communications message together, I think you'd see very similar things. And that will keep happening with, every time Americans elect someone to totally sort of uproot this system from the ground up, that's going to keep happening.
I say that here all the time.
Yeah. So what are the lessons for a potential Sanders administration to take from this era to be able to, if they were to take power in the White House, hold power and wield it effectively in a relatively non-corrupt manner?
In a relatively non-corrupt manner.
You do the best you can, right?
Well, I think the biggest lesson that a potential Sanders administration would take in terms of how to properly wield power as a Democratic administration is it obviously would not try to make the same mistakes, or what I'm sure President Sanders would see as the mistakes that President Obama did, which is expending a lot of political capital and literally years on dealing with the Republicans as if they were not overtly trying to stop every single thing you were trying to do. There's not going to be a grand bargain of the Sanders administration.
Yeah. I also think he's probably not going to staff up with, a lot of people with Wall Street ties and things like that. It'll probably be a little different.
Sanders is not going to be.
Yeah, you need to figure out how to draw on the institutional knowledge of people who know how to work those levers in Washington without letting it sort of compromise the reasons that you were elected.
Which is incredibly difficult.
It's incredibly
difficult. That's what we learned with the Trump project. Last question, Swin. We talk about this on the show all the time. Your story, you guys reported a couple months back that Trump is afraid of socialism, and he thinks that his advisors are underestimating how difficult it could be. How is that pouring out? In the months since you reported that and Sanders has risen, what are you hearing more from Trump world on that?
Well, that's still something that the president will regularly tell his closest advisors and Republican donors at private functions and during private deliberations. Something that's different from a lot of his public rhetoric and what...
And the RNC.
Yes, exactly. And what some of his closest advisors will say, especially publicly into the cameras, is that Trump has repeatedly told people close to him and GOP donors at high roller events that, and I'm only lightly paraphrasing here, that people think socialism is going to be so easy to steamroll and beat in the form of Sanders or a Warren or whoever in a general election. But I got to tell you, when you start telling people, particularly young people who are terrified by crushing student debt, that we're going to give you this and we're going to give you this and we're going to wave a magic wand and it's all going to go away. That's a tough one to run against. He specifically tells people that it's not going to be as easy as people think, which goes towards the fact that even if he doesn't agree with the politics or the ideology of it, he's very self-aware about the populist appeal of it, which is, of course, a way he rode to power in 2016.
Yeah, he ran to Hillary's left on a number of, populist economic issues.
No, absolutely. And again, in a lot of ways, that was just a total and complete lie, but he at least said it. He knew what sold well. So when people keep saying that, Team Trump is lusting to run against Bernie Sanders, they think he's the easiest to beat or collapse. I got to tell you, the president absolutely does not actually think that, according to people who I've spoken to who he said this privately to. And also, a lot of his closest advisors don't actually
I don't think that. I mean, if you understand the appeal of Trump, I don't see how you can underestimate Sanders. That's why the show exists. Anyway, thank you guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys. Congrats on the book. Sinking in the Swamp. You guys should check it out.
Sinking in the Swamp. Everybody go on Amazon and buy it.
Absolutely. Or Barnes & Noble or wherever.
Or wherever.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll have more for you right after this.